Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The Oregon Historical Society received the collection on a rain-soaked morning in November 1987, when the last surviving member of the Caldwell family donated 17 boxes of documents dating back to the early 1800s. Among yellowed correspondence, faded daguerreotypes, and crumbling ledgers, archivists discovered what would become one of the most disturbing genealogical mysteries in Pacific Northwest history. The centerpiece of this collection was a leather-bound testament written in an elegant hand that belonged to one Margaret Caldwell, dated October 13th, 1847. Margaret Caldwell had been the matriarch of a prosperous farming family that settled in the Willamette Valley during the Great Western Migration. Historical records indicated she had arrived from Pennsylvania with her husband, 3 children, and considerable wealth accumulated from textile manufacturing. The family established themselves on nearly 2,000 acres of fertile land, building what contemporaries described as one of the finest homesteads west of the Mississippi River. Yet by 1890, the Caldwell name had vanished entirely from local records, their property abandoned and eventually reclaimed by the state. Dr. Elena Morrison, a specialist in 19th-century American genealogy, was assigned to catalogue the collection. Her initial assessment suggested nothing unusual about the family's documentation until she encountered Margaret's final testament. Unlike typical wills of the period, this document contained provisions that defied conventional legal understanding. The language was precise yet cryptic, establishing inheritance conditions that seemed designed not to distribute wealth, but to bind future generations to increasingly specific and inexplicable obligations. The will's opening passages appeared standard enough, detailing the distribution of land, livestock, and household possessions among Margaret's 3 children, Thomas, Elizabeth, and young William. However, subsequent clauses introduced requirements that grew progressively more peculiar. Each heir was obligated to maintain detailed journals, documenting their daily activities, thoughts, and dreams. These records were to be preserved in perpetuity and made available to all subsequent generations. Failure to comply would result in immediate forfeiture of inheritance and what Margaret termed the awakening of deeper consequences. More troubling were the specific behavioral mandates embedded throughout the document. Descendants were forbidden from selling the family property, leaving Oregon permanently, or marrying outside of carefully defined geographical boundaries. The will established a complex system of surveillance among family members, requiring monthly gatherings where each person's journal entries would be read aloud and discussed. Margaret had somehow anticipated the growth of her lineage, creating provisions for great-grandchildren not yet born and establishing protocols for family meetings that could accommodate dozens of participants. Dr. Morrison's research revealed that the Caldwell family had indeed followed these instructions with remarkable dedication for over 4 decades. County records showed regular property tax payments, and local newspapers occasionally mentioned the family's monthly gatherings, which neighbors described as somber affairs, lasting well into the night. The Oregon State Hospital admitted its first Caldwell family member in 1863, a young woman named Sarah, who claimed to hear her deceased great-grandmother's voice, providing detailed instructions for daily living. The pattern of mental deterioration among Margaret's descendants became increasingly evident as Dr. Morrison cross-referenced the family documents with medical records and newspaper accounts. By the 1870s, 3 more Caldwell family members had been institutionalized, all exhibiting similar symptoms: obsessive record-keeping, paranoid delusions about family obligations, and an overwhelming fear of violating what they called grandmother's covenant. Local physicians noted the unusual consistency of their conditions, particularly their shared belief that Margaret continued to monitor their compliance with her posthumous demands. The most disturbing aspect of Dr. Morrison's investigation was the discovery of hundreds of journal entries written by multiple generations of Caldwell descendants. These documents, preserved exactly as Margaret's will had required, revealed a family trapped in an escalating cycle of psychological torment. Each generation seemed more deeply affected than the last, with journal entries becoming increasingly erratic and filled with references to Margaret's continuing presence in their daily lives. The final entries, dated 1889, belonged to Margaret's great-grandson, a man named Robert, who had inherited the responsibility of maintaining the family's compliance with his ancestors' demands. His handwriting deteriorated dramatically over the course of his final year, and his last entry consisted of a single sentence repeated 347 times. "She watches from the walls and counts our failures." The following spring, neighbors discovered the Caldwell homestead empty, with no indication of where the remaining family members had gone. Dr. Morrison's preliminary report to the Oregon Historical Society recommended that the Caldwell collection be transferred to a specialized archive for documents related to historical psychological phenomena. Her recommendation was accompanied by a personal note expressing her growing unease with the material and her intention to discontinue research into the family's fate. The circumstances surrounding Margaret Caldwell's death in October 1847 remained poorly documented until Dr. Morrison uncovered a series of letters exchanged between the local physician, Dr. Josiah Fletcher, and his colleague in Portland. These correspondences, written in the weeks following Margaret's passing, revealed disturbing details about her final months that had been deliberately omitted from official records. Dr. Fletcher described a woman consumed by an inexplicable obsession with controlling her family's future, spending her dying days crafting what he termed the most elaborate and troubling legal document he had ever witnessed. Margaret's illness had begun in the summer of 1847, manifesting initially as severe headaches and episodes of disorientation. Dr. Fletcher's notes indicated that she experienced vivid hallucinations involving deceased relatives who allegedly provided her with specific instructions regarding her family's destiny. These visions grew increasingly detailed and commanding, leading Margaret to spend entire nights writing feverishly by candlelight. Her husband, Jonathan Caldwell, had confided to Dr. Fletcher that Margaret claimed to receive visits from her own grandmother, a woman who had died in Pennsylvania decades earlier. The physician's correspondence revealed that Margaret's condition defied medical understanding of the period. She displayed periods of remarkable lucidity, alternating with states of profound agitation, during which she would speak of generational obligations and the necessity of binding her descendants to prevent what she called the family's dissolution into darkness. Dr. Fletcher noted that Margaret possessed an uncanny ability to predict future events related to her children's lives, accurately forecasting illnesses, accidents, and personal decisions weeks before they occurred. Local church records, discovered among the collection D, provided additional insight into Margaret's final months. Reverend Nathaniel Cross documented several disturbing incidents involving Margaret's attendance at Sunday services. She had begun interrupting sermons to deliver what witnesses described as prophetic warnings about the spiritual dangers facing pioneer families. Her declarations focused obsessively on the importance of maintaining family unity through rigid adherence to ancestral wisdom, themes that would later appear prominently in her testament. The actual composition of Margaret's will had required the assistance of 3 different legal scribes, as the first 2 had refused to complete the document after witnessing Margaret's increasingly erratic behavior during dictation sessions. The final scribe, a traveling lawyer named Hiram Gooding, left detailed notes about the experience in his personal journal. Gooding described Margaret as possessing an almost supernatural awareness of legal precedents and inheritance law, despite having no formal education in such matters. She dictated complex clauses with precision that suggested extensive legal knowledge, yet claimed the language was being provided to her by unseen advisors. Most troubling was Gooding's account of Margaret's insistence on incorporating specific phrases and requirements that seemed designed to create psychological dependency among her heirs. She demanded the inclusion of language that would make descendants feel personally responsible for maintaining her posthumous presence within the family structure. The will contained subtle psychological manipulations disguised as legal obligations, creating a framework that would gradually erode the mental stability of anyone bound by its terms. Dr. Fletcher's final letter to his Portland colleague, dated 3 days before Margaret's death, expressed his growing conviction that her condition represented something beyond conventional medical understanding. He described witnessing Margaret engage in lengthy conversations with invisible presences, receiving detailed instructions that she would immediately transcribe into additional codicils for her will. The physician noted that Margaret's handwriting remained remarkably steady and elegant, even during her most severe episodes, as if the act of writing was being guided by an external force. The circumstances of Margaret's actual death added another layer of mystery to her legacy. Jonathan Caldwell reported finding his wife seated at her writing desk on the morning of October 13th, having apparently died peacefully during the night while adding final provisions to her testament. The completed will lay before her, the ink still wet on the final page, which contained a single sentence that would haunt her descendants for generations. "This covenant shall bind all who share my blood until the last name is forgotten and the land reclaims what was taken." Local folklore, preserved in oral histories collected by the Oregon Historical Society, suggested that Margaret's death coincided with several unexplained phenomena throughout the Willamette Valley. Neighbors reported strange lights emanating from the Caldwell homestead for 3 consecutive nights following her passing, and multiple families documented the sudden death of livestock and the failure of crops in the immediate vicinity of the property. The reading of Margaret's will took place 1 week after her burial, conducted in the presence of all 3 children and several witnesses. Contemporary accounts described the profound impact the document had on those present, with several attendees noting the children's visible distress as the increasingly bizarre requirements were revealed. Thomas Caldwell, the eldest son, was recorded as stating that his mother had bound them to something that should have died with her. The immediate aftermath of Margaret Caldwell's testament reading marked the beginning of what local observers would later describe as the family's gradual descent into collective obsession. Thomas Caldwell, as the eldest heir at 26, assumed responsibility for ensuring his siblings' compliance with their mother's increasingly demanding posthumous requirements. His personal correspondence with business associates in Portland revealed a man struggling to maintain normal social and commercial relationships while adhering to obligations that defied rational explanation. The first monthly family gathering occurred in November 1847, exactly 4 weeks after Margaret's burial. Thomas documented the event in meticulous detail, establishing a pattern of record-keeping that would consume the family for decades. His account described the profound discomfort experienced by all participants as they read aloud from journals they had been compelled to maintain since their mother's death. Elizabeth, the middle child, had filled 37 pages with observations about household routines, weather patterns, and disturbing dreams featuring their deceased mother, providing specific instructions for daily activities. William, the youngest at 19, demonstrated the most severe early symptoms of what would become the family's hereditary psychological deterioration. His journal entries, preserved among the historical collection, revealed an alarming preoccupation with his mother's continued presence in the household. He documented conversations with Margaret's spirit, recording detailed advice about farming decisions, financial investments, and personal relationships. Local physician, Dr. Fletcher noted William's rapid weight loss and the development of nervous habits that included compulsive hand-washing and an inability to sleep in darkness. The family's adherence to Margaret's behavioral mandates created increasingly visible changes in their social standing within the community. The Caldwells had previously been active participants in local church activities and social gatherings, but their new obligations gradually isolated them from normal pioneer life. Neighbors reported that family members would abruptly excuse themselves from conversations to record observations in small notebooks they carried constantly. The monthly gatherings became sources of local speculation, as the sounds of distressed voices could be heard emanating from the Caldwell homestead well past midnight. Elizabeth's marriage prospects, which had been promising before her mother's death, deteriorated rapidly as potential suitors became aware of the family's strange new customs. Her journal entries from early 1848 revealed growing resentment toward Margaret's posthumous control over her personal relationships. The will's geographical restrictions prevented her from accepting a marriage proposal from a merchant in California, and the requirement for detailed documentation of all social interactions made courtship virtually impossible. Elizabeth's mental state began showing signs of strain as she struggled between her desire for independence and her terror of violating her mother's covenant. The psychological impact of the journal reading sessions intensified throughout the winter of 1847 to 1848. Thomas documented how each gathering seemed to strengthen their collective belief in Margaret's continuing surveillance of their activities. Family members reported experiencing identical dreams in which their mother appeared to review their journal entries and expressed disappointment with their compliance efforts. These shared visions created a feedback loop of anxiety and obsessive behavior that reinforced their adherence to increasingly irrational requirements. By spring 1848, the Caldwell family's behavior had attracted the attention of territorial authorities. A report filed with the Oregon territorial government described concerns about the family's mental stability and their potential inability to maintain their substantial property holdings. The document noted that all three siblings had developed nervous conditions that interfered with their ability to conduct normal business affairs. Thomas had begun requiring written contracts for simple transactions, insisting that all agreements be documented in the same elaborate style as his mother's testament. The first indication of the curse's generational nature appeared when Elizabeth gave birth to her daughter, Sarah, in September 1848. Despite the infant's obvious inability to comprehend such matters, Elizabeth began reading portions of Margaret's will to the child during feeding times. Her journal entries from this period revealed a growing conviction that early exposure to their grandmother's requirements would protect Sarah from the psychological torment experienced by the first generation. This practice would establish a pattern of indoctrinating children into the family's obsessive documentation system from birth. Local church records documented the family's increasing isolation from religious community life. Reverend Cross noted that the Caldwells had ceased regular attendance at Sunday services, claiming that Margaret's spirit had instructed them to conduct their own worship ceremonies at the homestead. These private religious observances allegedly involved reading passages from the Testament alongside traditional scripture, creating a hybrid belief system that elevated Margaret's posthumous demands to the level of divine commandment. The economic consequences of the family's psychological deterioration became evident by late 1848, when neighboring farmers reported that the Caldwell property showed signs of neglect despite the family's continued residence. Crops remained unharvested, while family members spent increasing amounts of time fulfilling documentation requirements and preparing for their monthly gatherings. The once prosperous homestead began its slow transformation into the abandoned ruin that would eventually be reclaimed by the state. The birth of Sarah Caldwell in 1848 marked the beginning of what historians would later recognize as the curse's most insidious phase, its transmission to those who had never known Margaret personally yet found themselves bound by her posthumous demands. As Sarah grew from infant to child, her mother Elizabeth documented every aspect of her development with obsessive precision, creating a record that revealed how Margaret's influence extended beyond death to shape the minds of those who had never experienced her living presence. Elizabeth's journals from Sarah's early years demonstrated the systematic indoctrination that would characterize the family's approach to child-rearing. Before Sarah could speak, Elizabeth had begun reading selected passages from Margaret's testament during daily routines, treating the document as a foundational text equivalent to religious scripture. The child's first words, carefully recorded by her mother, included fragments of legal language from the will, suggesting that Margaret's complex terminology had become part of the household's everyday vocabulary. By age 5, Sarah exhibited behavioral patterns that alarmed visiting relatives from Pennsylvania, who had maintained correspondence with the Oregon branch of the family. These distant cousins reported that the child demonstrated an unnatural preoccupation with record-keeping, insisting on documenting her daily activities in primitive drawings and symbols before she had learned to write properly. More disturbing was Sarah's apparent familiarity with family history that predated her birth, including detailed knowledge of Margaret's final illness and the circumstances surrounding the testament's creation. The monthly family gatherings evolved during this period to accommodate Sarah's participation, creating rituals that further entrenched the family's psychological dependence on Margaret's continuing influence. Thomas had constructed a special chair for Sarah that positioned her at the same height as the adults during journal readings, symbolically including her as a full participant in the family's obsessive documentation practices. Elizabeth's records indicated that Sarah often provided corrections to adult family members, journal entries, demonstrating knowledge of events she could not possibly have witnessed. William's mental deterioration accelerated significantly following Sarah's birth, as he became convinced that Margaret's spirit was using the child as a conduit for increasingly specific instructions. His journal entries from 1853 described elaborate conversations with Sarah in which the 5-year-old allegedly transmitted detailed farming advice, financial guidance, and warnings about future family challenges. Local physician, Dr. Fletcher documented William's growing inability to distinguish between Sarah's childish observations and what he perceived as Margaret's posthumous communications. The isolation of the Caldwell family from normal community life became complete during this period, as neighboring families grew increasingly uncomfortable with Sarah's precocious and unsettling behavior. School records indicated that attempts to enroll Sarah in the local one-room schoolhouse failed after she repeatedly disrupted lessons by insisting that her grandmother's spirit disagreed with the teacher's instruction methods. Her detailed knowledge of adult family business and her habit of speaking about deceased relatives as if they were present made other children fearful of her company. Elizabeth's own psychological state showed marked deterioration as she struggled to balance her maternal instincts with her obligations to Margaret's testament. Her journal entries revealed growing paranoia about her ability to properly prepare Sarah for her future role as the family's record keeper and covenant guardian. Elizabeth began experiencing what she described as visitations from Margaret's spirit, during which she received detailed instructions about Sarah's education and development. These alleged encounters left Elizabeth physically exhausted and emotionally unstable, requiring her to spend entire days in bed, recovering from the psychological strain. The economic decline of the Caldwell property continued throughout the 1850s, as the family's attention remained focused on fulfilling Margaret's requirements rather than maintaining their agricultural operations. Thomas attempted to hire outside laborers to compensate for the family's neglect of practical matters, but workers consistently refused to remain on the property for extended periods. Local folklore suggested that the homestead had acquired a reputation for supernatural occurrences, with reports of strange lights, unexplained sounds, and the persistent sensation of being watched by unseen presences. Sarah's 6th birthday in September 1854 coincided with what Elizabeth described as a significant escalation in Margaret's posthumous demands. The child allegedly began receiving direct instructions from her deceased grandmother, bypassing the adult family members who had previously served as intermediaries. These communications involved increasingly complex requirements for documentation and behavior modification that suggested Margaret's influence was growing stronger rather than diminishing with the passage of time. The pattern of shared psychological symptoms among family members intensified during this period, with all 3 adults reporting identical dreams and visions involving Margaret's continued presence in their daily lives. Dr. Fletcher's medical notes described a form of collective madness that seemed to strengthen through mutual reinforcement, creating a closed system of delusion that became more elaborate and consuming with each passing year. The Oregon State Hospital received its first Caldwell family member on a fog-laden morning in March 1863, when Sarah arrived in the custody of territorial authorities following what witnesses described as a complete psychological collapse during a family gathering. At 16, she had become the primary keeper of Margaret's testament, a responsibility that had gradually consumed her ability to function in the world beyond the family's increasingly isolated homestead. Dr. Jeremiah Hawthorne, the hospital's chief physician, documented her admission with particular attention to the unusual nature of her condition. Sarah's medical file, preserved in the hospital's archives, revealed symptoms that defied conventional psychiatric understanding of the period. She demonstrated periods of remarkable intellectual clarity, alternating with episodes of profound agitation, during which she would recite lengthy passages from legal documents with perfect accuracy. Dr. Hawthorne noted that Sarah possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of her family's genealogy, extending back several generations, including intimate details about relatives she had never met and events that had occurred before her birth. The circumstances leading to Sarah's institutionalization began with the death of her Uncle William in February 1863. His passing had left Sarah as the sole remaining family member capable of maintaining the complex documentation system required by Margaret's testament. The psychological pressure of this responsibility, combined with her lifelong indoctrination into the family's obsessive practices, had triggered what Dr. Hawthorne described as a complete dissociation from reality. Sarah claimed to be in constant communication with deceased family members who provided her with detailed instructions for managing the living relatives, compliance with Margaret's posthumous demands. Elizabeth's own mental state deteriorated rapidly following her daughter's hospitalization. Her journal entries from this period, among the most disturbing documents in the historical collection, revealed a woman consumed by guilt over her failure to protect Sarah from the family curse, while simultaneously feeling compelled to continue fulfilling Margaret's requirements. Elizabeth began experiencing what she described as punishment visits from her mother's spirit, during which she received increasingly harsh criticism for allowing the family's covenant to be broken through Sarah's removal from the homestead. Thomas, now the sole remaining functional family member, struggled to maintain both the property and the elaborate record-keeping system that had defined their lives for over 15 years. His correspondence with Portland business associates revealed a man desperately attempting to appear normal while managing obligations that had become utterly consuming. The monthly family gatherings continued despite Sarah's absence, with Thomas reading aloud from her hospital letters and maintaining her chair at the table as if she might return at any moment. Doctor. Hawthorne's treatment notes documented his growing fascination with Sarah's condition, which seemed to represent a form of inherited psychological disorder unlike anything in contemporary medical literature. Sarah demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict events related to her family's welfare, accurately forecasting her mother's declining health and her Uncle Thomas's increasing financial difficulties weeks before these problems became apparent. The physician began to suspect that the family's shared delusions had created a form of collective consciousness that transcended normal psychological boundaries. The hospital's records indicated that Sarah's presence had a disturbing effect on other patients, many of whom began reporting dreams and visions involving an elderly woman who provided them with detailed instructions for organizing their personal belongings and maintaining written records of their daily activities. Several patients developed compulsive documentation habits similar to those exhibited by the Caldwell family, suggesting that Sarah's condition possessed a contagious quality that defied medical explanation. Elizabeth's death in November 1863 marked a turning point in the family's psychological deterioration. Thomas discovered her body in Margaret's former bedroom, seated at the same writing desk where his mother had composed her testament 16 years earlier. Elizabeth had spent her final hours adding new provisions to a document she had been secretly drafting, which appeared to be an addendum to Margaret's original will. This supplementary testament contained even more elaborate requirements for future generations, suggesting that Margaret's influence had continued to evolve and strengthen through Elizabeth's psychological breakdown. The reading of Elizabeth's addendum to the family gathered at the hospital, where Sarah listened from her bed as Thomas recited the new obligations that would bind any surviving descendants. Dr. Hawthorne observed this scene with growing alarm, noting that Sarah's condition seemed to improve dramatically as the additional requirements were revealed. She began speaking coherently for the first time in months, expressing relief that her mother had properly prepared for the continuation of Margaret's covenant despite her own death. Thomas's final journal entry, dated December 1863, revealed his growing awareness that the family curse had claimed another generation while simultaneously strengthening its hold on those who remained. He wrote of feeling Margaret's presence more strongly than ever before, as if Elizabeth's death had somehow amplified their mother's posthumous influence over the surviving family members. The birth of Sarah's son, Daniel, in the Oregon State Hospital during the winter of 1864 represented a disturbing evolution in the Caldwell family curse. Hospital records indicated that Sarah had concealed her pregnancy for months, claiming that Margaret's spirit had instructed her to remain silent until the child's arrival. Dr. Hawthorne documented the unusual circumstances surrounding the birth, noting that Sarah demonstrated remarkable composure throughout labor, while insisting that her deceased grandmother was present to guide the delivery process. Daniel's early development within the hospital environment provided Dr. Hawthorne with an unprecedented opportunity to observe how the family's psychological condition manifested in a child raised entirely within institutional walls. Unlike previous generations who had been indoctrinated gradually into the family's obsessive practices, Daniel exhibited signs of inherited psychological disturbance from his earliest months. He demonstrated an unusual sensitivity to written materials, becoming agitated when separated from papers and documents, and showed a precocious ability to recognize and respond to his mother's documentation rituals. Sarah's maternal behavior defied conventional understanding of the bond between mother and child. Rather than displaying typical protective instincts, she treated Daniel as a vessel for continuing Margaret's posthumous influence. Hospital staff observed Sarah conducting elaborate ceremonies in which she would hold the infant while reciting passages from memory, creating what appeared to be a form of psychological conditioning designed to prepare Daniel for his future role as the family's covenant keeper. The child's development accelerated in ways that alarmed hospital personnel. By age 2, Daniel had begun exhibiting behaviors that suggested an awareness of family history that extended far beyond his limited life experience. He would arrange small objects in patterns that corresponded to the layout of the abandoned Caldwell homestead, despite never having seen the property. More disturbing was his apparent ability to complete his mother's journal entries when she became too agitated to continue writing, producing text that maintained the same style and content as her previous work. Dr. Hawthorne's research into the family's history during this period uncovered additional evidence of the curse's generational transmission. He discovered that Margaret's own grandmother had died under mysterious circumstances in Pennsylvania, leaving behind a collection of documents that bore striking similarities to the testament that had consumed the Oregon branch of the family. This discovery suggested that the psychological condition affecting the Caldwells might represent a hereditary pattern extending back multiple generations. Thomas's visits to the hospital became increasingly infrequent as his own mental state deteriorated throughout the 1860s. His final documented visit in 1867 revealed a man who had aged decades in the span of a few years, consumed by his solitary maintenance of the family's obligations. Hospital records indicated that Thomas spent his visit reading aloud from journals he had maintained in Sarah's absence, seeking her approval for his continued compliance with Margaret's requirements. Sarah's responses suggested that she had assumed a position of authority within the family hierarchy, despite her institutionalization. The financial collapse of the Caldwell estate became inevitable, as Thomas proved unable to manage both the property and his psychological obligations. County records showed that by 1868, the family's substantial holdings had been reduced to a fraction of their original value through neglect and Thomas's increasingly erratic business decisions. Local authorities began proceedings to declare Thomas mentally incompetent, citing his inability to distinguish between the family's imaginary obligations and legitimate legal requirements. Daniel's 4th birthday in 1868 coincided with what hospital staff described as a significant escalation in both his and his mother's psychological symptoms. The child began demonstrating knowledge of events occurring at the family homestead, despite having no contact with the outside world beyond Thomas's visits. He would provide detailed descriptions of the property's deteriorating condition and accurately predict Thomas's emotional state during upcoming visits, suggesting a form of psychological connection that transcended normal family bonds. Sarah's condition showed marked improvement during this period, as if Daniel's development had somehow relieved her of the psychological burden she had carried since childhood. She began speaking more coherently about the family's history, providing Dr. Hawthorne with detailed accounts of Margaret's final months and the circumstances surrounding the testament's creation. These revelations suggested that Sarah possessed knowledge that had never been documented in the family's extensive records, as if she had access to information that existed only in the collective unconscious of Margaret's descendants. The hospital's decision to separate Daniel from his mother in 1869 triggered the most severe psychological crisis in the family's documented history, setting the stage for the final phase of the Caldwell curse. The forced separation of Daniel from his mother Sarah in 1869 unleashed what Dr. Hawthorne would later describe as the most profound psychological catastrophe he had witnessed in his medical career. The decision to place the 5-year-old child in the hospital's children's ward had been made following concerns about Sarah's increasingly erratic behavior toward her son, but the consequences of this intervention exceeded all expectations. Within hours of the separation, both mother and child began exhibiting symptoms that suggested their psychological connection transcended normal familial bonds. Sarah's reaction to Daniel's removal manifested as a complete catatonic state that persisted for 3 weeks. During this period, she remained motionless in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling while her lips moved silently in what appeared to be continuous recitation of legal text. Hospital staff noted that her condition seemed to fluctuate in direct correlation with Daniel's emotional state in the children's ward. When the child experienced distress, Sarah's catatonia would deepen, and when he showed moments of calm, she would briefly return to consciousness before retreating again into her unresponsive state. Daniel's behavior during the separation period alarmed even the most experienced hospital staff. The child demonstrated an uncanny ability to navigate the hospital's complex layout despite having been confined to his mother's room for his entire life. He would appear in corridors and rooms throughout the facility, always carrying scraps of paper on which he had written incomprehensible symbols that bore resemblance to the legal terminology found in Margaret's testament. More disturbing was his apparent knowledge of other patients' personal histories, which he would recite with accuracy that suggested access to confidential medical records. Thomas's final visit to the hospital occurred during this crisis period, and his encounter with the separated family members marked the beginning of his complete psychological collapse. Hospital records indicated that Thomas spent several hours attempting to communicate with Sarah, reading aloud from journals he had maintained in her absence. When she failed to respond, he turned his attention to Daniel, who allegedly provided him with detailed instructions for managing the family's remaining obligations. The content of these instructions, as recorded by observing staff, included references to family members who had been dead for decades and property arrangements that defied legal logic. The child's influence over other patients became increasingly pronounced following his separation from Sarah, Dr. Hawthorne documented numerous instances of patients throughout the hospital beginning to exhibit behaviors characteristic of the Caldwell family's condition. These individuals, who had no previous contact with the family, began maintaining obsessive written records of their daily activities and expressing fears about violating unspecified ancestral obligations. The hospital's patient population seemed to be developing a collective form of the psychological disorder that had consumed Margaret's descendants. Dr. Hawthorne's attempts to understand the mechanism behind this apparent contagion led him to conduct extensive interviews with Daniel, despite the child's young age. These sessions, documented in the physician's private notes, revealed that Daniel possessed detailed knowledge of psychiatric theory and medical terminology that far exceeded his educational background. The child spoke about psychological inheritance and generational trauma with sophistication that suggested either remarkable precocity or access to information through means that defied rational explanation. The discovery of Thomas's body at the abandoned Caldwell homestead in November 1869 marked the effective end of the family's presence in Oregon outside the hospital walls. Local authorities found him in Margaret's former bedroom, seated at the writing desk where both his mother and sister had composed their final documents. Thomas had spent his last hours creating what appeared to be a comprehensive genealogical chart that traced the family's psychological deterioration across multiple generations. The document included predictions about future descendants and detailed instructions for managing the family's posthumous obligations that extended far beyond any reasonable planning horizon. The reading of Thomas's final document at the hospital created an immediate crisis among the remaining family members. Sarah emerged from her catatonic state with startling suddenness, demonstrating complete awareness of her brother's death despite having no external source of information. Her first coherent words in months consisted of detailed corrections to Thomas's genealogical work, suggesting that she had somehow maintained awareness of events occurring outside the hospital during her period of unresponsiveness. Daniel's reaction to his uncle's death revealed the full extent of his psychological inheritance from Margaret's curse. The child began speaking about family obligations and ancestral responsibilities, with an authority that seemed to position him as the new head of the family hierarchy, despite his age. Hospital staff observed him conducting elaborate rituals in his room, arranging personal belongings in patterns that corresponded to the layout of legal documents, and maintaining written records with the same obsessive precision that had characterized previous generations of Caldwells. The final documented entry in the Caldwell family records appeared in Robert's journal on March 15, 1889, exactly 42 years after Margaret's death. By this time, Robert had become the sole adult descendant capable of maintaining the elaborate documentation system that had consumed his family for nearly half a century. His handwriting, once precise and elegant like his great-grandmother's, had deteriorated into barely legible scrawls that reflected the profound psychological toll of his inherited obligations. The entry consisted of a single observation repeated obsessively across 17 pages. The walls of the homestead had begun to show signs of what he described as Margaret's permanent residence. The Oregon State Hospital's records from this period indicated that Sarah had died in her sleep during the winter of 1888, leaving behind a collection of documents that hospital staff found too disturbing to preserve in their entirety. Dr. Hawthorne, now elderly and nearing retirement, noted that Sarah's final writings contained detailed instructions for Daniel's future responsibilities as the family's covenant keeper. These documents allegedly included provisions for managing obligations that would extend well beyond Daniel's natural lifespan, suggesting that Margaret's influence had evolved to encompass multiple future generations simultaneously. Daniel, now 25, and the hospital's longest residing patient, had developed into what staff described as a living repository of the family's accumulated psychological burden. His condition had stabilized into a form of functional madness that allowed him to maintain detailed correspondence with Robert while remaining completely detached from reality outside the family's obsessive framework. Hospital records indicated that Daniel spent his days creating elaborate charts and diagrams that mapped the psychological connections between living and deceased family members, treating Margaret's posthumous influence as a measurable force that could be tracked and predicted. The abandonment of the Caldwell homestead occurred gradually throughout 1889, as Robert's ability to maintain both the property and his documentation obligations finally collapsed under the accumulated weight of 4 decades of psychological pressure. Neighbors reported seeing lights in the windows long after Robert had ceased appearing in town for supplies, leading to speculation that the property had become home to transients, or that Robert had lost the ability to distinguish between day and night. The reality, as revealed in his final journal entries, was far more disturbing. Robert's last coherent writings described experiencing what he termed the convergence of all previous generations within the homestead's walls. He claimed to witness daily gatherings attended by Margaret, Elizabeth, Thomas, William, and Sarah, during which the deceased family members would review his compliance with their accumulated requirements and provide additional instructions for managing obligations that had grown beyond any single person's capacity to fulfill. These alleged encounters left Robert physically and emotionally exhausted, requiring him to spend increasing amounts of time in bed, recovering from what he described as the overwhelming presence of his ancestors. Expectations. The discovery of the empty homestead in April 1889 by county officials conducting a property assessment revealed no signs of violence or struggle, but rather evidence of a systematic preparation for departure that defied logical explanation. Personal belongings had been arranged in precise patterns throughout the house, with family documents organized according to a complex filing system that seemed designed to preserve the records for future discovery. Most unsettling was the condition of Margaret's former bedroom, where officials found the writing desk surrounded by hundreds of pages covered in handwriting that appeared to represent multiple different hands, as if several people had been working simultaneously to complete a massive documentation project. The fate of Robert and Daniel remained a mystery that would perplex local authorities for decades. Hospital records indicated that Daniel had simply vanished from his room one night in March 1889, leaving behind only a note stating that he had been summoned to fulfill his final obligations to the family covenant. No evidence of escape or outside assistance could be found, and the hospital's security measures made unauthorized departure virtually impossible. Similarly, Robert's disappearance from the homestead left no trace of his destination or method of travel. Dr. Morrison's investigation into the Caldwell family's ultimate fate, conducted nearly a century later, uncovered local folklore suggesting that both men had been seen walking together along rural roads in the weeks following their disappearances. These sightings, reported by multiple witnesses who had no knowledge of each other's accounts, described two figures carrying large bundles of papers and moving with apparent purpose toward the mountains east of the Willamette Valley. No subsequent traces of their presence were ever documented, leading to speculation that they had sought to break the family curse by removing themselves and their accumulated records from the civilized world entirely. The Oregon Historical Society's final assessment of the Caldwell collection concluded that the family's fate represented one of the most complete and disturbing examples of inherited psychological disorder in American frontier history, leaving behind only questions that would never find satisfactory answers. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.